Hi, everybody. Tonight, we journey far back in time, beyond the reach of our modern world, into the golden sands and shadowed alleys of ancient Egypt, a land of marvels, mystery, and monumental splendor. But while the temples gleamed and the Nile flowed serenely beneath the stars, not all lives basked in glory. This story is about those lives hidden behind the limestone grandeur, behind the pharaohs and the gods, a story of the hardest, most sorrowful, and most forgotten jobs in that ancient kingdom. In this 22-part tale, we shall move gently through time, imagining what it might have felt like to live those lives, quietly, humbly, painfully. Let us begin with one such soul now. The sky above the Nile hung low that morning, veiled by a pale mist that softened the hard edges of the palms and the jagged rise of half-buried ruins. In a tiny hamlet west of Thebes, nestled at the boundary where reed marshes gave way to parched fields, a boy named Hapu stirred before the first bird dared cry. His mother's call was soft, but the weariness in her voice cut deeper than any noise. She did not shake him roughly, nor urge him quickly. There was no rush, only inevitability. It was his 12th birthday. There would be no celebration, no offerings of honeyed bread or stories by firelight. That day, Hapu would begin the work that had claimed his father's bones. The memory of his father lingered not in laughter, but in mud-caked sandals by the door, and in the way his back had curved like a river reed before the end. Silt digging, so the elders said, was a job as old as the Nile itself. When the river flooded each year, it left behind not just fertile soil, but heavy layers of black sludge. That silt, so vital for the grain and vegetables that fed Egypt's many mouths, clogged the irrigation ditches and canals, and it was the poor who were summoned to clear it. The boy stepped outside into the gray dawn, a coarse linen kilt tied at his waist, his eyes adjusting to the dull light. Other figures moved silently through the village, men and boys alike, hunched against the morning damp, their tools slung over shoulders. No one spoke much. Even the animals were quiet. Thin goats nibbled at dry twigs, while a lone donkey brayed as though in mourning. They marched along the narrow dirt road, past half-sunken storage huts and fields of barley yet to sprout, until they reached the canal trench. There, a supervisor stood on a slight embankment, his arms crossed, a length of leather curled in one hand like a sleeping serpent. His kilt was cleaner than theirs, his posture unbent. Without introduction or ritual, he barked orders, and the line of workers broke apart, each moving to his designated stretch of muck. Hapu was assigned a small patch near the water's edge, where the silt was thickest and darkest. A man old enough to be his grandfather handed him a woven basket and a flat wooden scoop, neither of which looked fit for the task. No words of welcome were offered, only a grunt and a glance toward the trench. With trembling fingers, Hapu dug his scoop into the sticky black mud. It resisted at first, clinging to the earth like a thing unwilling to be disturbed. When he finally wrenched it free, the weight startled him. It wasn't merely soil. It was history, life, and death compressed into something both rich and rotten. He tipped it into his basket, then struggled to lift it. The handles bit into his palms. He slipped on his first walk up the bank. The mud betrayed him, and the basket tipped, spilling its contents back into the water with a thick plop. The overseer's eyes found him immediately, and the leather twitched in his hand. But before punishment fell, a voice intervened. A grizzled man beside him muttered, "First day," and gave a slight nod toward the boy. The whip did not strike, but its promise hung in the air like incense in a tomb. All morning, Hapu worked. He did not speak. His arms burned, his back screamed, his knees trembled with each rise and fall. Around him, others moved with the rhythm of those who had long ago surrendered hope. Some chewed on bitter roots between tasks. One older man spoke to himself in low tones, perhaps to keep the silence at bay. Another, toothless and bent, occasionally looked to the sky, as if seeking permission to stop. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, burning down with a pitiless eye. The air grew thick with the scent of water and decay, of sweat and rot. Flies gathered in clouds, drawn by the sweat on their skin and the filth on their feet. There was no pause, no relief, only the steady, endless clearing of mud that would return again with the next flood. In the afternoon, Hapu's hands blistered. Blood mixed with the silt in his basket. He bit his lip to keep from crying out. Around him, no one offered sympathy. There was none to give. The Nile had no favorites, and the mud no mercy. At sunset, the day's work ended without ceremony. The overseer said nothing, only unrolled a papyrus scroll and scratched a tally with a broken reed. The workers turned homeward. Hapu staggered more than walked, his limbs foreign and swollen. Back in the village, smoke curled from cooking fires. His mother sat near their small hearth, stirring a pot of lentils. She looked up, her face unreadable, then handed him a flat loaf of barley bread. It was hard and dry, but he chewed it slowly, as though it were the finest meal. His sister, small and quiet, crawled into his lap, her hands wrapping around his tired arms. He did not push her away. His mother whispered, "Your father would be proud," and then fell silent, eyes watching the flicker of flame. That night, Hapu lay on the mat beside his sister. The stars above twinkled like distant gods watching without care. In his dreams, he stood once more in the trench, the basket at his side, the whip overhead. He did not speak. He only worked, and so began his life beneath the surface of memory, where history does not linger and no scrolls record. One boy, like many, swallowed by a kingdom built not only by kings, but by hands calloused and forgotten. Tomorrow would come, and the silt would rise again. The next tale belongs to a man named Teddy, whose days passed beneath stone rather than sky, in the deep chambers and suffocating tunnels of the necropolis. To many in Egypt, death was not an end, but a continuation, a journey for which the body must be carefully prepared, adorned, and entombed with honor. But for Teddy, who served as a tomb cleaner in the Valley of the Kings, death was not sacred. It was a constant companion, a breath on his neck, a silence that pressed too closely. He was born in a laborer's quarter on the edge of the workers' village known as Set Mat, or the place of truth. The name was beautiful, almost poetic, but the truth it held was a harsh one. The village was built for those who crafted the tombs of pharaohs, artisans and masons and painters. Yet Teddy's father was no artisan. He was a sweeper of tunnels, a scraper of bones, and from him, Teddy inherited not just his tools, but his silence. Each morning, before Ra's light touched the cliffs of Deir el-Medina, Teddy descended into darkness. With a flickering oil lamp, a rough chisel, and a damp cloth, he made his way into tombs where the air was thick with dust and memories. His task was simple: keep the tombs clean. Not pristine, not beautiful, merely clean enough that when the priests visited or the officials toured, they could breathe without choking on cobwebs. The darkness was his world. Down there, past the hidden doors and painted walls, the air was old. It clung to his skin like linen soaked in sweat. The scent of decayed oils and mold lived in every corner, and the silence was not empty but full of whispers, of imagined footsteps, of the sound of his own heartbeat echoing against stone. Some tombs were new, barely finished. The scent of fresh paint still lingered in the hieroglyphs, the colors bold against the limestone. But others were old, tombs where the paint had peeled, where offerings had long since crumbled to dust, and the gods drawn upon the walls looked less divine and more like spirits slowly fading from memory. Teddy moved quietly, always alone. His work was thankless. He swept rat droppings from the corners, cleared cobwebs from the faces of long-dead priests, and polished statues of gods that no longer received prayer. Sometimes he found bones, small, forgotten fragments of servants buried near their masters, or stolen remains discarded by tomb robbers. These he placed in piles outside the tunnel mouths, where someone else would gather them for reburial, or, more likely, ignore them. The pay was meager: a few measures of grain, the occasional fish, and oil for his lamp. No gold, no linen, no amulets. He had no family of his own, only a sister who had long since married into another quarter, and a mother whose voice he had not heard since childhood. She had once told him that the dead watched over those who walked carefully. Teddy walked carefully, but he was not immune to fear. Not truly. There were nights when the lamp would flicker too low and the walls would seem to breathe. He would imagine footsteps, voices calling from behind sealed sarcophagi, a hand brushing the back of his neck. In those moments, he would sit with his back to a wall, legs drawn in, waiting for the flame to steady before continuing. There were stories among the tomb workers, whispers of curses, of men who went mad after spending too many hours in certain tunnels. The tomb of Akhenaten was said to hum when no one spoke. Another, deeper and more hidden, was avoided entirely by the older men, who claimed they once saw a jackal with glowing eyes standing guard at its entrance. Teddy knew better than to ask questions. He swept, he cleaned, he endured. One afternoon, while clearing dust from a carved doorway, he found something curious. A small amulet, no longer shining, wedged behind a loose stone. It was shaped like a scarab, its wings spread wide. Teddy picked it up, turning it over in the light of his lamp. There were markings on its belly, ancient, worn. He could not read them. He considered pocketing it. It was the only beauty he had touched in weeks. But he remembered the warnings of his father. What belongs to the tomb belongs to the gods. And so, with a reluctant sigh, he placed it carefully on a nearby altar, brushing away the dust around it. It gleamed faintly, as if in approval. That night, he dreamed of a voice. It was not angry or loud. It was quiet, like the rustle of cloth in a tomb shaft. It whispered only once, "Thank you." He awoke cold, though the night was warm. He checked the amulet the next day. It was gone. The weeks passed. His hands grew more calloused. His eyes adapted further to darkness. He no longer flinched at the sight of small bones, nor recoiled from the tomb's scent. He became part of that underworld, a silent ghost among the stone guardians. Few knew his name. Fewer cared. But when priests passed through the tombs and marveled at how undisturbed the chambers were, how smooth the floor remained, how clean the altars stood, they never spoke of Teddy. They assumed, perhaps, that the gods had preserved these sacred spaces, and in some way, perhaps they had. Or perhaps it was simply one man moving alone through dust and death who kept the dead from being forgotten. And so beneath the weight of silence and stone, Teddy worked. Tomorrow would come, and the tombs would wait. In the shadows of Memphis, where the wind carried both the scent of lotus and the sourness of tannins, a young woman named Setka tended to her duties with silent resignation. She was not a priestess, nor a servant of the gods. She was a tanner's daughter, born to the stink and sting of hides soaked in urine, her life shaped not by the heavens, but by the hides of goats and the skins of cattle stretched taut beneath the sun. The trade was one of the oldest and most repulsive in all of Kemet. Without leather, the kingdom would falter. Sandals, chariot bindings, belts, shields, scroll wrappings, all came from the work of hands like Setka's. But with it came the filth, the flies, the aching hands, and the shameful looks of those who passed her family's workshop, holding cloths to their noses as though the stench might leap upon them like a curse. Her father, Harkuf, was a large man, once strong, now hunched. His arms were corded with muscle, but his lungs wheezed from years breathing in the acrid stew of lime and rot. He had taught Setka every part of the work from the age of 6, how to scrape the flesh from the hides using a crescent blade, how to soak them in urine to loosen the hair, how to wash them afterward in brine before laying them flat in the sun. Urine. That was always the part no one wanted to speak of. But it was essential. Collected in clay jars from chamber pots throughout the city, some donated, others sold by those even poorer than they, it served to soften the skin and break the fibers. To Setka, the smell was as familiar as river water. She barely noticed it anymore, but others did, and they never let her forget. She was not unkind. Her eyes were gentle, her voice low, her movements precise. But in the market, mothers pulled their children away from her. At temple festivals, she stood alone, watching the dancers from the edge, her hands still raw beneath the linen wrappings she used to hide her cracked fingers. No one sought to know her thoughts, only her product. The leather straps, the soft pouches, the reins that princes would pull without ever knowing who had cut the hide, who had scraped it until her nails bled. There was no magic in her world, only toil. The worst days were during the summer floods. The tannery flooded too, and the stagnant water mixed with blood and bile, creating a soup of pestilence that clung to their skin long after the work ended. Setka and her father would work knee-deep in filth, slapping mosquitoes from their arms as they turned the hides again and again, trying to salvage what they could. The smell would rise like a living creature, pressing against the city walls, shunned even by dogs. But there were quiet moments. At dusk, when the work ceased and the sun dipped behind the palms, Setka would sit on the stone threshold of their hut and wash her hands in a bowl of vinegar and myrrh. She would look toward the temple spires in the distance and imagine, just for a moment, that she was among the perfumed acolytes singing praises to Hathor. Sometimes, when no one watched, she hummed to herself. Old songs her mother had sung, before the coughing took her, before the disease that turned her yellow and hollow. Setka still remembered the way her mother's hands had felt, calloused yet warm, brushing the hair from her brow in the darkest nights. One evening, a priest came to their shop. He needed leather for the straps of a sacred drum, and only the finest would do. Her father was ill, his coughing worse, and so Setka presented the hides herself. She had chosen them carefully, rubbed them with cedar oil, stitched their edges so finely they looked smooth as papyrus. The priest said nothing. He examined them, nodded, and left. The pay came 2 days later, a small bundle of barley and a worn amulet depicting Bez, the protector of the household. A strange choice, Setka thought, but she kept it nonetheless, placing it beside the mat where her father slept. In time, her father faded. His breathing thinned like the hides he once worked, and one morning he did not wake. She prepared his body herself, washed it with palm wine, wrapped it in linen, said the prayers with a voice that quivered but did not break. No priest came to bless the corpse. No neighbors offered words of mourning. But she buried him in the edge of the workyard, beneath a fig tree whose roots reached deep into the same soil that had once soaked their hides. Alone now, she carried the trade forward. Some days she thought to close it, to run away to the fields, to become a gleaner or a water carrier. But she remained, for in the stink, in the grind, there was something else, dignity. Not the kind sung by poets or carved in stone, a quieter kind. The dignity of survival, of making something useful with one's hands, even when the world turned away. And so Setka, daughter of hides, child of brine and blade, lived and worked, and the leather she cured, though no one knew, traveled far. It crossed deserts, wrapped the arms of scribes, buckled the sandals of warriors, bound the scrolls of nobles. No one thanked her, but the leather remembered. And in the silence of the tannery, between the wind and the flies, she sang. There was a man whose days were stitched not with thread, but with wounds. His name was Mena, and his craft was that of the embalmers. Among the steep alleys of Saqqara, beneath the shadow of the step pyramid, he worked in the house of purification, where the dead were prepared for their journey to the west. But for Mena, the journey never led anywhere. It circled endlessly, body to body, scent to scent, beneath oil lamps that flickered like the uncertain breath of the souls he tended. He was not a priest, though many believed he must be. He did not wear white linen robes, nor chant over golden sarcophagi. His world was smaller, his tasks more intimate. He was the one who made the first cut. Each morning, before the gates of the necropolis were unlocked and the early birds swept across the sand, Mena descended into the embalming chamber. It was built of thick mud brick, cool and shadowed, lined with stone tables where bodies lay like broken instruments awaiting repair. The air held a stillness that was not peace, but anticipation, the sort that lingers just before a storm. The bodies came often, old, young, rich, poor. Most were stiff and silent by the time Mena saw them. Some had been dead for days, their skin bloated, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Others came swaddled in fine linen, their faces covered in perfume to mask the smell that not even prayer could dispel. All were equal beneath his blade. The first incision, made on the left flank, was always precise. The blade, crafted from obsidian and bone, was sharpened daily and used with reverence but never fear. Mena would slice, remove, and sort. Stomach, liver, lungs, intestines, each carefully extracted and placed into canopic jars, guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. Then came the heart, and finally the brain, drawn out through the nose with hooked tools, a task as delicate as it was gruesome. The worst part was the stench. No incense, no oil, no resin could mask it. It clung to the chamber like smoke in a sealed tent. It slipped beneath the skin and lived behind the eyes. Mena no longer smelled it, not truly. His nose had dulled long ago. But he saw it in the faces of new apprentices, the gagging, the pallor, the shiver when they touched the cold flesh. Many did not last more than a week. But Mena endured. He had once been a boy from the Delta, the son of fishermen. A fever took his village when he was 12 and only he remained. The embalmers took him in, fed him, taught him to wash bodies, to pack them with natron, to wrap them in 1,000 tight layers of cloth. At first he wept each night. Then the tears stopped. Then he began to sing. Mena hummed as he worked. low, tuneless songs that echoed off the brick walls. He believed the dead preferred it, that they felt the rhythm even as their souls sailed toward the horizon, guided by Anubis. Sometimes he spoke to them, not of great things, of small things, the weather, the bread he'd eaten, a dream he had. His voice was a thread between this world and the next. He worked with care, with respect, not for praise. There was none. The priests conducted the rites, the families wept, the tombs bore the names. But no one remembered the man who had touched the body first, who had cleaned the filth, who had sewn the skin with flax thread as gently as a mother tucking in her child. There were dangers, too. Disease crept into cuts and sharp tools betrayed careless hands. Once, Mena nicked himself on a rib and spent 2 weeks fevered and raving. He saw visions of the dead standing at the edge of his mat, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering his name. When he awoke, he found he had bitten through his own lip. But he returned. The chamber needed him. The bodies did not stop coming. One day, an unusual corpse arrived. Young, barely more than a girl, her skin pale as the morning moon. The guards whispered she had been a temple singer, drowned in the river after a fall from the ferry. Her body was light, water-soaked. Mena touched her brow and felt the sorrow like a weight upon his chest. He worked slower that day, wrapping her in linen, woven finer than any he had seen. He placed a lotus blossom beside her, though no one had asked for it. That night, he dreamed of a voice singing, a lullaby not heard since childhood. He did not wake until dawn, and the chamber was brighter somehow, as if a soul had passed peacefully for once. Years passed. His hands stiffened, his back ached. But still he cut, still he cleaned, still he wrapped. And when the time came for Mena to die, no procession followed him. No temple bells rang. Only his apprentice, a boy with trembling hands and eyes still bright with fear, prepared his master. He made the first cut. He removed the organs, he packed the body with natron, and then he wrapped the limbs, one by one, just as he had been taught. But before sealing the wrappings, he placed something small upon Mena's chest, a lotus blossom, dried and pressed. No one knew why, but the dead perhaps remembered. Beyond the fertile stretches of the Nile, where the desert began to reclaim the land with its shifting gold, there stood a camp of low tents and rough-hewn huts, beaten by wind and scorched by sun. It was here that the stone haulers lived, those who carved no names into monuments, but whose backs bore the true weight of empire. Among them was a man called Nebef. Nebef was born in the shadow of sandstone cliffs, the son of a quarryman and a woman who once wove baskets for grain stores. His father died before he could speak, crushed by a falling block meant for a nobleman's tomb. From that day, Nebef's fate was sealed not by lineage, but by labor. The gods, it seemed, demanded stone, and it was Nebef's lot to give it. He was a broad man, though not by choice. His strength was earned through endless repetition, muscle grown under the whip of survival. His hands were split and thickened like the bark of desert trees. His skin bore the red tint of dust, and his eyes, though young, had the weariness of stone that has watched too many seasons pass without change. Each day began before dawn. The overseers arrived with torches, calling the men from their beds of woven mats. They were given a thin porridge and a jar of tepid water, barely enough to last the morning. Then they marched to the quarry, where the blocks waited like silent beasts. The stone was cut from the earth using copper chisels and dolerite balls. Nebef would swing the dolerite endlessly against the face of the cliff, chipping away at the resistant heart of the rock. The sound of stone against stone filled the valley, rhythmic and relentless, like the heartbeat of something ancient and unfeeling. The heat rose quickly, even in winter. Sweat slicked every back, stung every eye. The men wore simple linen wraps, often so stained with dust and blood they were indistinguishable from their surroundings. There was little shade. A few scraggly tamarisks stood watch, offering no comfort, only the illusion of relief. When a block was freed, the true ordeal began. Wooden sleds were dragged by teams of men, dozens at a time, across the sand toward the river. The sand had to be wetted first, else the sled would sink and splinter. Nebef and the others poured jar after jar of precious water, every drop a sacrifice, before laying down palm fibers and pushing forward. The sled screamed against the earth. Ropes dug into shoulders, feet slipped, backs bowed, whips cracked overhead, not out of cruelty, but desperation. The stone had to move. If it stayed too long in the sun, it cracked. If it cracked, the gods were displeased. If the gods were displeased, someone would bleed. Nebef had once lost a toe beneath a shifting block. He had wrapped it himself in strips of his own tunic and limped for a week. There was no healer, only time. The river was the goal. From there, the blocks were ferried downstream to the temples and tombs that hungered for them. Nebef never saw those places. He had heard stories, of course, of columns taller than trees, of statues with eyes of lapis that gazed forever toward the horizon. But his world ended at the riverbank. He had a wife once. Her name was Iti, and she had eyes like wet clay, soft and deep. They met at a festival, their hands brushing over a shared cup of beer. She laughed at his rough voice and gave him a garland of reeds. But marriage in the quarry camp was a fragile thing. Food was scarce, and labor demanded every hour. She died in childbirth, their first and only son slipping into the world and out again in the same breath. Nebef never spoke of them. He carved her name into the wall of his sleeping hut where the wind could not reach it. One evening, as the sun bled across the desert sky, the men returned to camp limping and silent. Nebef sat alone, sharpening his chisel by firelight. A younger worker, barely more than a boy, came to sit beside him. "Do you ever think of leaving?" the boy asked. Nebef stared into the flames. His voice came low, like distant thunder. "There is nowhere to go." The boy said nothing after that. At night, the wind howled through the quarry, bringing with it the ghost sounds of hammer and rope. Nebef dreamed of stone that wept, of temples that swallowed men whole. He awoke often, his body aching, but his hands already curling as if to lift again. In the years to come, his strength waned. His chisel strokes grew slower. The overseers noticed. He was assigned to the watering team, pouring jars onto the sand so younger men could haul the blocks he once moved with pride. He did not protest. The stone demanded what it demanded. When he died, they wrapped his body in linen stiff with dust, placed a piece of the quarry stone beneath his head, and buried him in the soft sand beyond the camp. No priest came, no prayer was sung. But the next morning, the sun rose on the stone face he had carved, and for a moment its edge caught the light like the curve of a smile. And the stone, though silent, remembered. The desert winds whispered over the necropolis of Abydos, stirring the linen wrappings of broken statues and rattling the reeds that lined the shallow canals. Within a weather-worn building of clay and thatch near the edge of the sacred grounds, there lived a woman named Tua, a temple laundress, whose days were drowned in water and whose nights dried under the weight of silence. Tua was neither young nor old. Time had softened the lines of her face, but it had not dulled the strength in her arms, forged from years of wringing, scrubbing, and lifting the wet offerings of linen and cloth that wrapped the divine. Her life was in service to garments, not her own, not her children's, for she had none, but those of the priests, the statues, and the gods themselves. It was said that even Osiris wore robes she had once pressed against the washing stones. Her mother had been a laundress before her, and her grandmother too. The knowledge was passed not with reverence, but necessity. From the age of 8, Tua had learned to carry the heavy buckets from the temple well, to lay cloth along the flat black stones that lined the washing terrace, to recognize the sacred oils that stained the priestly garments and distinguished them from the sweat of ordinary men. She rose each day before the ibis stirred, her mat rolled and her feet bare against the cool earth. The work began in silence. Buckets were filled before the first light touched the temple walls. The priest's robes, fine linen bleached by sun and purified with natron, were unwrapped and counted carefully. Any mistake meant defilement, any delay, a curse. Tua scrubbed with a rhythm born of repetition. She used river clay, crushed lotus root, and soapwort leaves ground into paste. The water reddened her hands, the heat cracked them, but the stains did not linger, except in her mind. There were no songs among the laundresses, only the sound of cloth against stone, the hiss of steam rising from boiled water, and the distant murmur of temple chants, forever just out of reach. Tua had once tried to hum as she worked, but an older woman slapped her hand and whispered, "The gods are listening. They do not want our music." The laundresses were not allowed into the inner sanctum. Their work passed through the hands of intermediaries, low-ranking acolytes who delivered the garments and returned them, sometimes still warm from the divine presence within. Tua longed, not for sight of the statues or the gods, but for the peace she imagined lingered inside the sacred halls, where lotus incense hung like mist and candles flickered gently instead of the sun's harsh glare. One day, a robe came to her soiled with something darker than oil. Blood. It was folded with care, but the stain was large, and the linen had stiffened. She asked no questions. No laundress did. She soaked it in warm water and myrrh, then scrubbed until her hands burned raw. The blood lightened, but never vanished completely. When she returned it, folded and pale, she saw the priest's eyes falter for a moment, just one breath of hesitation, before he took it. He said nothing, but he did not look at her again. Tua lived alone. Her hut was small, filled with drying herbs and a single woven idol of Taweret, the goddess of motherhood, though Tua had never borne a child. Some nights she would place her hands upon the idol's rounded belly and whisper things she had never told anyone, secrets soaked into cloth, burdens washed away by river water that always carried more than it revealed. Once, during a heavy rain, the river swelled and overflowed. The washing terrace flooded, carrying robes and linens downstream toward the fields. Tua chased after them, her skirts heavy with mud, slipping on the slick stones as the others shouted and wept. She found one robe snagged on a reed, another caught in a tree. She saved what she could. When the storm ended, she dried each piece herself, laying them upon the roof of her hut like offerings to the sky. The temple priest said little, a nod, a murmured word of thanks. But the next week, she found a jar of honey beside her doorstep, and inside it, wrapped in waxed cloth, a ring bearing the eye of Horus. It was not gold. It held no spell, but she wore it on a cord around her neck from that day on. As she aged, her pace slowed. Her hands no longer wrung with the same strength, but still they moved with the care of one who believed that linen held more than thread, that memory, sorrow, and sanctity could be folded within a garment. On her final day, she laid each robe in its place, cleaned and pressed. She filled the buckets one last time, set the crushed lotus root to soak. Then she sat beside the washing stone, her back straight, her eyes closed, listening to the faint sounds of temple song carried by the wind. No one saw her pass. They found her there the next morning, still seated, her face serene, her hands in her lap. The other laundresses did not wail. They did not chant. They washed her body in silence, wrapped her in linen she herself had cleaned, and buried her beneath the reeds, where the water could still be heard. And though her name was never carved into any temple wall, each robe that passed through the sacred halls bore a trace of her labor, a quiet mark of devotion, invisible, but eternal. In the furthest reaches of the marshes, where the Nile frayed into narrow, twisting channels veiled in green, there lived a man named Keku, whose trade was one most dreaded of all. He was a mosquito burner. It was not an official title, not one granted by scribes or overseers, but it was the name whispered by those who saw him, moving like a shadow through the reed beds at dusk. Torch in hand, smoke trailing behind him like a cloak of thorns. Keku had no lineage to boast, no trade passed from father to son. He had come from nothing, and to nothing he would return. He was one of the invisible, the lowest tier of the kingdom, those who lived beyond the temples and beyond the records, but whose work kept the rot from the rest of Egypt. His task was simple: to burn, to smoke, to chase away the endless clouds of biting insects that bred in the wet silence. The marshes were beautiful from a distance. Egrets moved like drifting spirits across the water's surface, and papyrus swayed in thick stands, humming in the wind. But to live among them was a curse. The water was stagnant, the ground soft and treacherous. Every breath carried the scent of rot, of mildew, of decay beneath green beauty. And where there was water, there were mosquitoes, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. They rose each evening like a black mist, humming with thirst, swarming every inch of flesh, not smeared with ash or oil. They carried more than pain, fevers, wasting sickness, chills that shook the strongest men to the bone. In the lowlands, children vanished each year to the long sleep. Keku had watched his own younger brother waste away, his body racked with heat, his eyes staring past the reed roof of their hut until they dulled. That was the year he took up the torch. Each evening, before the sun touched the horizon, he would dip bundles of dried dung, resin, and bark into fish oil and light them. The smoke they gave off was acrid, eye-watering, clinging to the hair and clothes, but it worked. It drove the mosquitoes into retreat, pushed them deeper into the reeds for a few hours of respite. With a long branch, he stirred shallow pits of smoldering coals, placed at the corners of every fishing camp, every threshing ground. He worked barefoot, his skin toughened to the cuts of sawgrass and the sting of thorns. His eyes were red-rimmed from years of smoke, and his voice rasped when he spoke, which was rarely. Most avoided him. They feared he was cursed, that he carried the fevers he fought, but they never turned him away when the torches came burning through the dusk. In the seasons when the river swelled, his task grew tenfold. New pools formed overnight, hidden beneath thick mats of algae. Keku waded through them, testing the water's edge with a staff, marking the most dangerous areas with broken reeds tied with red string. He dug channels with a crude shovel, trying to drain what he could, but the land always won. The water always returned. Some nights he lay in his hut and listened to the hum of wings press against the woven walls. He could not escape them entirely. No one could. His legs bore the scars, rows of bites, some still raw, others faded to ghostly marks that never left. When he did sleep, it was often in fits. Fever dreams would take him, sometimes from memories, sometimes from nothing at all. He would wake with sweat on his brow, though the night was cold. He spoke to no gods, not because he did not believe, but because he felt no god would stoop so low as to bless the work of a mosquito burner. Even the village priest, who offered prayers for the harvest and the fishermen, never spoke Keku's name aloud. And yet, when his own child fell ill with fever, it was Keku they summoned. It was Keku who came with smoke and flame, who stood watch through the night, stoking the fires and chasing the dark hum back into the reeds. The child survived. The priest never thanked him. But each week afterward, a small bundle of grain appeared outside Keku's hut, wrapped in palm leaf. Keku aged before his time. His hair grayed early, his joints stiffened from the damp, and his sight began to blur in one eye. Still, he walked the marshes. Still, he lit the fires. One season, the river did not flood as it should. The marshes dried, and the mosquitoes rose in desperation. That year, many died. Keku did not. He worked harder, smoked longer. His torch never dimmed. When he passed, it was not with ceremony. A few men from the village found him at the edge of the water, his body curled near a circle of cold ash, torch still in hand. They buried him on a small rise, where the reeds thinned and the wind could pass without whispering. No tomb was carved, no shaptis placed at his side, only a small torch, planted in the earth beside his grave, which the villagers kept lit through the long season of sickness. And though no statue bore his likeness and no hymn carried his name, the marshes grew quieter for a time. And in that silence, Keku was remembered. In the heart of a bustling work site not far from Heliopolis, where the sun god was honored with towering obelisks and endless prayer, a boy named Becket toiled in the heat as a paint grinder. His world was color, but not the joy of it. Only the burden, the endless effort to mix and measure the precious pigments that gave life to the walls of temples and tombs. He was no artist. His hands were not steady enough for the fine lines of sacred figures, nor trusted to paint the eyes of gods. Instead, he served the color makers, those who turned minerals and metals into the red of fire, the blue of heaven, the green of rebirth. It was not the colors themselves that were heavy, but the labor required to make them live. Becket had come to the work at the age of 10. His father, once a laborer, had grown too sick to continue the backbreaking hauling of stones. And so the boy took his place, though he did not lift blocks or pour sand. He was placed in the pigment quarters, among stone mortars and shallow dishes filled with bright, dangerous dusts. His first task had been to grind malachite into powder, a task simple in description but endless in practice. With a thick pestle of dolerite, he pounded the green stones until they split, then continued until the fragments turned to grains and then to dust. His arms ached constantly. His fingers blistered. The fine powder clung to his skin, wormed its way into his eyes and throat, and left a taste in his mouth like old copper. Other colors were harder still. To make red, he ground ochre from the cliffs to the west, a dry, brittle earth that resisted every stroke. To make blue, he crushed lapis lazuli brought from distant lands, its deep, beautiful hue masking the fortune it cost and the weight it placed upon his lungs. The air in the grinding room was thick with minerals, and the walls were stained like the palettes of the gods. But there was no beauty in it, only coughs that never left and eyes that watered even when dry. He learned not to speak, not because he was told to stay silent, but because speech stirred the dust. Every breath was a risk. The older grinders wore strips of linen across their faces, and though Beckett fashioned one for himself, it did little to block the shimmer of floating poison that lingered in every shaft of sunlight. Once a week, the artisans would come to collect the powders. They inspected the pigments with critical eyes, judging them not by the labor, but by their purity, their smoothness, their luster. If a batch was too coarse or dull, it was returned, and Beckett had to begin again. There were no apologies, no explanations, only the expectation of perfection. He envied the painters, though their lives were not easy either. They at least stood beneath the open sky, their brushes telling stories upon the stone. Beckett remained beneath reed mats and plastered walls, his only stories those etched into his palms by the slow violence of his work. But still he took pride. A quiet kind. He watched, from a distance, as his pigments were carried away, mixed with water, and stroked onto the walls of the rising temple. He saw the gods take shape in red and gold, the lotus bloom in his blue, the Nile painted in green, reborn through his pain. He whispered to himself the names of each color in turn, Waj for green, Kennet for blue, Dasher for red. They became his companions. One evening, as the sun bled down into the western desert, he climbed to the edge of the scaffolding and looked out over the city. The walls shimmered in the golden light, and the painted panels seemed to glow. He knew where his work lived, even if no one else did. But there were costs. His cough worsened as he grew. The dust did not leave his lungs, and his strength faded in his late teens, far sooner than it should have. The master of pigments gave him simpler tasks, mixing water with binders, drying the pastes, but even that became difficult. Eventually he was replaced, quietly, without anger, just as the stones were replaced or the tools when they broke. Beckett returned to his father's home, though his father had long since passed. He kept a few bowls of pigment beside his mat, and now and then, when he had the breath, he would grind just a little. Not for the temple, for himself. He painted small things, leaves, birds, circles of the sun, on shards of broken pottery. He buried them in the soil outside, whispering to them as though they were seeds. When he died, no painter came to see him. No priest chanted over his body. But someone, perhaps one of the apprentices who had once watched him work, placed a small jar of powdered green beside his wrapped form. The lid was sealed, the color untouched, and though the wind carried away the dust of his life, the walls he once colored remained. The gods still gleamed, and the boy who painted nothing had, in truth, painted everything. In the low-lit corridors of the House of Records in Wasset, where the scent of ink mingled with the must of ancient papyrus, a man named Hori worked as a scribe's assistant, though even that modest title overstated his place. He was not permitted to write. He was not trusted with ink or stylus. His duty was far more humbling. He was the ink preparer. Among the layers of administration that kept the machinery of ancient Egypt turning, temple inventories, harvest reports, tomb permissions, and tax collections, the scribes stood high in honor. They were scholars, close to priests, their words shaping the law and preserving the deeds of kings. But their tools, the simple black and red inks that filled the hollow tips of their reed pens, came from men like Hori, who never signed a name and never wrote a word. Each day before the sun had lifted its head above the pylons of the temple complex, Hori entered the narrow stone chamber where the pigments and supplies were stored. He moved like a shadow, silent and precise, knowing every bowl and every bundle of reed by memory. His hands were perpetually stained, fingers darkened with soot, his palms red from ochre. Black ink was his main task. It was made from soot gathered from burned oil lamps, carefully mixed with gum arabic and water. He ground it on flat stones until the texture was as smooth as the Nile's surface at dawn. It was tedious, muscle-cramping work, and required hours of uninterrupted attention. If the ink was too watery, the scribes scolded. If it was too thick, the pens broke. There was no room for error. He prepared red ink more rarely, used only for divine names, for important dates, for headings that stood out upon the papyrus. Red was made from iron oxide, crushed fine as breath, and it clung to the lungs more cruelly than any soot. Hori wore a cloth over his nose, but it never helped much. His cough had begun the year before and had never left him since. He worked in near silence, save for the scratch of reeds from the rooms nearby and the muttered dictation of scribes as they copied letters and scrolls. He heard stories but never spoke them. He knew of shipments sent south to Nubia, of land disputes in the Fayum, of harvest tallies and temple endowments. He knew things that others would kill to learn, but no one ever asked him. To them, he was barely more than furniture, a moving part of the inkwell. Hori had once learned his letters. As a boy, his uncle, a junior scribe, had taught him the alphabet, how to shape the curl of the reed, how to balance the strokes. He had been a quick learner, dreaming of becoming a writer of tomb prayers, a recorder of kings. But when his uncle died in a building accident, the connection to that world vanished. He was left with knowledge but no name. His family had no coin for formal schooling. The House of Records took him in, not as a student, but as a supplier. He never complained, at least not aloud. But sometimes in the quiet hours before the scribes arrived, he would take a bit of charcoal and a shard of broken pottery and write tiny fragments, words he remembered from his uncle's lessons. Light, truth, wind. Then he would scrub them away with a cloth before the morning bell. One day, he prepared a new batch of ink for the chief scribe, a man of great girth and greater impatience. The scribe tested it and declared it imperfect, too dry. He ordered Hori to grind another bowl, then left without a word. The boy apprentice beside him offered a fleeting glance of pity, but said nothing. There were no allies in such places, only tasks. Hori returned to the stone and ground again, slower this time, breathing through the ache in his shoulder. He worked until the sun stood high and the flies came in from the garden court to buzz at the ink. That night, he walked home through the narrow streets of Waset. His sandals were worn, the straps mended with thread, and his tunic clung to his skin with sweat and dust. But he carried with him a tiny scrap of papyrus, discarded, crumpled, its edges ink-stained. On it, he had written a single line in the quiet moments of the afternoon. "The pen is the tongue of the gods." He read it again under the flickering torchlight before bed. Then he folded it, pressed it into a clay jar beside his mat, and lay down. Years passed. His back stooped. His hands grew slower. But still he mixed. Still he prepared. No scribe ever spoke his name in thanks. No scroll bore his signature. But when he died, an apprentice scribe found the jar beside his sleeping place and opened it. Inside were dozens of scraps, lines of poetry, proverbs, small stories written in a hand practiced and neat. The apprentice read them all and then copied them onto a fresh scroll. It circulated anonymously among the scribes. They marveled at its grace, its cleverness. They spoke of the hidden scribe, the ghost in the ink. And though Hori's body lay beneath the sand with no stone to mark it, his words, silent, patient, beautiful, lived on. Let us now drift into the realm of the ancient embalmer's assistants, those who served in the peripheries of the sacred, but bore none of its reverence. Their hands, soaked in foul oils and crusted with salt, were instruments of a ritual both feared and revered. These were not the high priests who chanted incantations to Anubis beneath sacred linen, but rather the anonymous men laboring in the shadows of the embalmer's tent. In the haze of the desert dawn, the assistant would be summoned long before the rising sun painted the cliffs of Thebes in gold. His duties began not with ceremony but with labor, hauling stiffened bodies from the reed-woven litters of grieving kin, arranging them on the cold slabs of black stone, and preparing them for the long, winding path toward preservation. There was no grandeur in this work. The skin of the deceased had begun to turn, a process the Egyptians dreaded, yet respected. The assistant, wrapped in rough linen, his face often covered with a cloth to stifle the stench, began the grim first stages. A priest might perform the opening of the body with a ceremonial blade, but it was the assistant who removed the organs, delicate, foul, and warm from the desert heat. His fingers knew the exact places to cut, the precise pressures to apply. He worked in silence, except for the flies that buzzed about like mourners without prayers. To serve in this role was to be feared by one's neighbors. The taint of death clung not just to his clothes, but to his presence. Many avoided these men in the streets, believing them cursed or worse, unclean in the eyes of Ma'at, the goddess of balance and order. Children were taught not to play near the houses of such men, and few women sought their company. But the assistant endured. When the organs were removed, they were cleaned, anointed, and placed in canopic jars, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines, each guarded by a deity with a beast's head and a watcher's eyes. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was sometimes left in place, or else treated with the highest care. Yet it was not the priest who did this work. It was the assistant, hands trembling but skilled, who gently wrapped the heart in linen soaked with sacred oils and nestled it back within the chest. The scent of the embalming tent was thick with natron and incense, yet nothing could disguise the bite of death. The assistant lived half his life in this space, between the living and the dead, scraping skin, stuffing cavities, and applying oils that clung to him like an unwelcome second skin. His work was repetitive, methodical, and emotionally draining. There was little conversation and no praise. Only the dead bore witness to his diligence. He was given meager coin, just enough to keep his family fed, never enough to climb from the roll. Promotion was unlikely. The priests protected their rights fiercely and seldom allowed assistants into their circle. And so many grew old in the shadows of the embalming chambers, their backs bent and hands scarred from the sharp tools and caustic substances they handled daily. And then there were the days the gods tested them. Sometimes a body came from the Nile, bloated and bitten. Other times, it arrived disfigured by wounds from war or beasts. These were the worst days. The assistant would steady himself, breathe through his mouth, and begin again. The dead had no say, and the living seldom showed gratitude, but still he pressed on. By night, he returned home, his hands too sore to hold his children, his breath touched by the smell of the grave. Some embalmers' assistants took to sleeping in separate quarters, away from wives and mothers who feared they brought death into the home. Their dreams were not of gold or fields of reeds, but of silence and blood, linen and stone. And yet, in a strange, aching way, they served a purpose more eternal than most. For the Egyptians believed in the immortality of the soul, and that the preservation of the body was the key to an afterlife of peace and joy. The assistant, though shunned, was a quiet guardian of this passage. He stitched the seams of eternity with needle and salt. His touch, rough and calloused, was a bridge to the divine. He would never be named in the scrolls, nor carved into the walls of tombs. No one would sing of his deeds or light lamps in his honor. But without him, the pharaoh himself would not reach the fields of Aru. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the shadows in your room lengthen, spare a quiet thought for the embalmer's assistant, the man who bore the weight of eternity without a word, the one whose toil ensured that others would sail peacefully into the afterlife, even as he was forgotten in the hush of history. Rest now. Let the flickering torchlight of the embalming chamber fade into soft darkness. Let the hum of ancient flies become distant and the scent of incense drift into dreams. We will return soon to find another soul in ancient Egypt whose labor bore no glory, only the heavy silence of necessity. The Nile moon was high, casting a pale sheen over the rooftops of Thebes, as we descend now into the next chapter of our gentle journey through toil and time. In this 11th part, we follow a man who worked not among the tombs nor within the temples, but below the surface of the earth, in the sweltering, suffocating belly of the land itself. He was a miner in ancient Egypt, and his story is carved not in hieroglyphs, but in calluses and sweat. Far from the lotus-scented air of the cities, the miner's world began at the edge of the desert, where the wind carried the fine sting of dust and the sun glared like an angry eye. The pharaoh's hunger for gold and turquoise, copper and malachite sent thousands into the eastern deserts and Sinai Peninsula, where stone mountains hid veins of wealth beneath layers of cruel silence. The miner's morning was night to most, for the work began early, before Ra had fully stretched his golden arms across the land. He and his companions, bound together not by kinship but by fate, would rise from their straw mats in temporary camps, their breath already dry from the arid air. Their feet, wrapped in worn sandals, would crunch across the brittle sands toward the gaping mouths of the mines. The entrance was often a narrow crevice in the side of a hill, reinforced with timber hauled by donkeys over vast distances. Beyond it lay an unforgiving maze of tunnels, black, cramped, and perilous. Each man carried a small lamp, its flame flickering with uncertainty. The deeper they descended, the more the air thickened, and the harder it became to breathe. The walls closed in, the heat grew unbearable, and the light dimmed to a trembling whisper. Their tools were simple: chisels of bronze or copper, stone hammers, and baskets made of reed to haul the ore. The task was to chip away at the rock, following faint veins of precious mineral, and then to carry the broken stone out to be crushed and sifted for traces of metal. It was relentless work and dangerous. At times, the walls gave way, burying men beneath rubble. In some mines, wooden beams creaked ominously, holding the very mountain from collapsing. The fear of being entombed alive was constant. And yet, there was no ceremony for those lost in this way. Their bodies, when unrecoverable, became part of the mine. The work continued, always. The dust invaded the lungs, clogging the breath and settling like sand in the belly. The eyes burned, the skin cracked. Many miners developed a deep, hacking cough that never left them, a dry rattle that echoed in the still of the night. Some were no older than 16, and others no longer remembered the softness of green fields. The desert had become their master. There were overseers, of course, taskmasters who carried sticks of polished wood and had the pharaoh's sigil on their robes. They shouted orders, counted baskets, and ensured the quotas were met. There was little room for rest, and water was given in sparing portions, carried in skin bags that grew hot under the sun. When the day was done, if it could be called that, in a place without proper light, the miners returned to their camps. There were no grand meals. A handful of bread, some dried fish if fortune smiled, and perhaps a weak beer made from barley. They slept in shifts, always aware of scorpions, snakes, and thieves. But it was exhaustion, not fear, that closed their eyes. And still, amidst the agony, there were moments of quiet camaraderie. A man might hum a hymn to Hathor, the Lady of Turquoise, whose temples stood watch near the richest mines. Another might pass a piece of fig cake saved from a ration to a friend who had lost his cousin in a collapse weeks before. They clung to scraps of humanity the way they clung to life, fiercely and silently. There were whispers, too, of magical stones and spirits who haunted the mines. Some believed that the deeper veins were guarded by old gods who punished greed with madness. The miners told tales of voices in the tunnels, laughter in the dark, and glowing eyes that watched from crevices no torch could reach. Whether born of fear or the mine's attempt to give shape to suffering, these stories were part of the air they breathed. The wealth they pulled from the rock never touched their hands. Gold was for the pharaohs, turquoise for the temples. They, the diggers of dreams, received nothing but cracked skin and early death. Few made it back to their villages, and those who did bore a silence deeper than the mines themselves. They had seen the underworld before death, and it left them hollow. Yet the world moved on, gilded by the glitter they unearthed. Crowns were inlaid with their labor. Statues of gods sparkled with their sacrifice. The gods were thanked. The miners were forgotten. So tonight, as you lie still and breathe deep, imagine the faint echo of a pick striking stone in some distant cave, a sound swallowed by time and sand. Picture a man's hands, bruised and bleeding, lifting a basket of stone with no promise of reward, only the faint hope of survival. Let the darkness of the mine become the darkness of sleep, deep, still, and free from toil. We will return, as always, to walk beside another soul hidden beneath the grandeur of ancient Egypt. In the hush of midnight, where the stars drift lazily above the Nile and the wind hums a soft song through the papyrus reeds, we turn now to another forgotten figure in the slow march of ancient Egyptian life. Our path leads us to the riverbank, to the damp edges of the land where wealth once flowed, and where men known as water haulers lived short, aching lives beneath the weight of jars and silence. These were not the canal diggers, nor the noble irrigation planners, but rather the lowliest of water bearers, those assigned to fetch, carry, and deliver water to the fields, homes, and workshops across the villages and cities of the Black Land. Their work was so commonplace, so constant, that it was barely regarded at all. And yet, without them, the beating heart of daily life would falter. They awoke before the ibis stirred from the reeds, their sleep always too brief, their dreams haunted by the coming weight of the day. Their tools were few, 2 heavy jars slung on either end of a yoke of sycamore or palm wood, carved roughly, with the memory of many shoulders worn into its curve. The jars, caked with dust and cracked by years of sun, were as much a part of their bodies as their limbs. Each morning began with the long walk to the Nile. It was not always close. In some villages, particularly during the low season, the river's edge might lie miles from where water was needed. The path was dry and treacherous, uneven ground, thorns, and scorching stones beneath bare feet. And always the sun rose quickly, mercilessly, bleaching the landscape and weighing down their steps. At the riverbank, the hauler would lower the jars carefully, letting them fill with the brown, silty water that was life to Egypt. There was no pause for reverence, only the rush to avoid the crocodiles that lurked with lazy hunger in the shallows, and the fear of falling in, a death not mourned, but merely replaced. Once filled, the jars became burdens of flesh and clay. With each step back, the yoke dug into the shoulders, pressing against bone and muscle. The jars sloshed, their contents threatening to spill with every lurch. And yet the hauler moved quickly, knowing that delays would bring scolding, or worse, a beating from overseers impatient for their workers to drink and resume toil. They delivered water to farmers bending under the sun in the fields, to potters whose hands were slick with clay, to women scrubbing laundry beside shaded walls, and to the construction crews heaving stones for new tombs. At every stop, there was demand. Sometimes gratitude, more often impatience. And then they returned, again and again. Dozens of trips each day. The body bent lower with each journey, the skin rubbed raw where the yoke pressed hardest. There was no room for rest. The weak were dismissed. Children replaced them. Even the elders, too frail for carrying, were sometimes forced to fetch smaller jars for shorter distances, earning mere crumbs of bread. Worse still was the task of hauling water uphill, toward the cliffs and tombs, or up the winding stairs of temples under construction. These climbs were slow torture. The muscles screamed. The breath came in rasps. The stone steps, worn and uneven, threatened to trip even the surest of feet. A stumble meant not just spilled water, but shattered jars. And a broken jar was a lost day's wage. Sometimes worse. There were few pleasures in the life of a water hauler. Some sang softly under their breath, old songs from their childhood villages, lilting, repetitive tunes that kept the pace steady. Others whispered prayers to Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile, or to Tauret, the goddess who protected the weak and the weary. Small amulets sometimes hung from their belts, tokens against exhaustion and despair. In the cooler twilight, as the day gave way to dusk, their backs would be stooped, their legs trembling from the day's demands. They returned their yokes to humble homes of mud brick and straw, where the air was heavy and the food sparse. Some had families, others lived alone, their only companion, the aching hush that came when the jars were finally set down for the last time. And yet, in their own quiet way, they sustained the kingdom. The scribes who wrote of wars and gods drank from their labor. The builders who raised obelisks and temples were sustained by the water they carried. Even the priests, in their golden robes, received libation water that had once sloshed on the shoulders of a nameless man. Still, the water hauler left no legacy in stone. No records, no prayers on tomb walls, only a trail of footprints in the dust, quickly swallowed by wind and time. So now, let your breath deepen, like the Nile at night. Let your thoughts become still, like the jars resting beneath a palm's shadow. Feel the quiet sorrow of footsteps worn into the earth and the soft hush of water that once flowed through calloused hands. We shall return soon, to walk again beside those whose burdens built a kingdom, even if no one remembered their names. In the pale hush that drapes the streets before dawn, when the last stars blink sleepily above the rooftops of ancient Thebes, there moved a man wrapped in silence and dust. His name was not carved into limestone, nor spoken with pride, yet his presence shaped the daily rhythm of life more surely than the toll of a temple bell. He was a street cleaner, an invisible hand that swept away the remnants of civilization before the city opened its eyes. He rose before the first cock crowed, in a narrow room behind a weaver's shop, his mat of reeds still warm from sleep. He would splash his face with water drawn the night before, eat a crust of barley bread if it remained, and wrap his worn tunic tighter against the lingering chill. His fingers, calloused and cracked, would reach for the reed broom propped in the corner, its bristles short and splayed like the tail of a tired hawk. His first steps into the alley were quiet, cautious, as if not to disturb the night too quickly. The air was thick with the scent of refuse that had ripened in the heat of the day before, spilled dates, broken fish bones, the acrid trace of chamber pots emptied hastily into the gutters. No one watched him work. No one waited to greet him. His task was as inevitable as the rising sun, and just as taken for granted. The streets he tended were narrow veins through the heart of the city, flanked by shuttered stalls and mud brick homes. The previous day's commerce had left its scars behind, fruit trampled into the dust, fabric scraps fluttering like wounded birds, and bones from roasted lambs discarded where the laughter had faded. He gathered it all into a woven basket strapped to his back, its base blackened by years of use. The broom whispered against the sandstone, a soft, repetitive scrape that only the rats and early crows seemed to notice. It was thankless labor. Merchants, upon opening their stalls later in the morning, never paused to wonder why their stretch of road was cleaner than they left it. The priests of neighborhood shrines nodded not in gratitude, but in habitual dismissal. His presence, his smell, his role, none were welcome. Children pointed at him sometimes, their eyes wide with mischief or revulsion. "There goes the dung man," they would whisper. "He carries the filth of all Thebes." And though he heard them, he never responded. What was there to say? He bore the worst of the city's cast-offs, not only what was thrown, but what was hidden. In darker corners, he'd find refuse too foul to name. Rotting cloths wrapped around something long dead, a bundle of feathers and bone left by a butcher with no time for burial. Once, he uncovered a mummified cat, curled and stiff in a broken basket. The animal's wide, staring eyes seemed to accuse him, though it was he who buried it just beyond the city's edge, offering a whispered prayer to Bastet under his breath. There were days of flooding when the Nile crept into the streets, leaving behind a film of slime and riverweed. On those days, his work was doubled, scraping muck from the corners of courtyards and prying debris from between stone steps. His feet would blister in wet sandals, and the weight of soaked waste bent him near to breaking. Yet he continued. He did not know if the gods noticed him. No priest ever offered a charm for his safety. No scribe ever penned his labors into record. But in his heart, he believed there was a quiet order to the world and that his work, lowly as it was, upheld something sacred. He remembered once as a boy seeing a procession pass, the pharaoh himself riding in a litter adorned with gold. The street had been swept beforehand, clean enough to reflect the sun, and he had thought, even then, someone did that. Someone made the path clean. Now he was that someone. At day's end, he would rinse his hands in a trough, the water darkening with grime. He would sit on a low wall, let the breeze cool the sweat from his neck, and eat whatever he could buy with the coin he'd earned. Often it was little, a handful of lentils, half a fig, a crust softened in beer. He would eat alone, his back to the world, and watch as the streets he'd tended filled once more with life and laughter and disregard. He grew old in this way. His joints stiffened, his eyesight dimmed, his breath came with a rattle. One day the broom grew too heavy, the basket chafed too cruelly. He lay down beneath an awning and did not rise again. When the weaver found him, she wrapped him in an old linen sheet and told the baker next door. There was no ceremony, no monument. Then another man took his broom the next morning and began the same path. But for those who know where to look, his work remains. In the smooth curve of a swept cornerstone, in the scentless dawn air, in the fleeting comfort of walking clean streets, never questioning the hands that made them so. Now, rest. Let the soft brush of the broom echo in your mind, gentle as the hush between waves. Let your breath deepen like the darkened alleyways, and your thoughts settle like the dust he once cleared. We shall return soon, to walk once more beside the unseen laborers of ancient Egypt's golden mirage. In the dimming twilight, as the last rays of sunlight turned the walls of tombs to embers, and the hush of the desert crept into the alleys of ancient villages, another figure stepped forward from the dust of forgotten days. This one did not carry stones or sweep the streets, nor did he haul water or walk the mines. His burden was not of weight, but of blood, cries, and uncertainty. For in part 14 of our journey through Egypt's harshest labors, we turn to the lowliest of healers, the temple wound cleaners and bone setters who lived on the margins of medicine. They were not priests of Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing, nor were they the esteemed scribes of anatomy who served the wealthy and the court. No. These were the men sent to treat the bodies of farmers crushed under yokes, of children scalded by cook fires, of workers burned by the sun or split open by tools turned wild. Their tools were crude, their remedies simple, their status barely above the beggars they often resembled. By day, they moved through the villages like shadows, summoned only when pain overcame pride. A woman would send a child running for help, and moments later the healer would arrive with his pouch of linen strips, jars of honey and lard, and thin slivers of bronze to dig out what splinters or thorns hid beneath the skin. His hands were steady, though his face wore the look of a man always half-starved of sleep and sunlight. His presence was tolerated, but never welcomed. People feared what he brought. Memories of pain, reminders of frailty. And worse still, many whispered that wounds left open by the gods should not be touched by mortal hands. There were those who claimed that healing without temple rites risked angering the divine. Yet desperation often overrode superstition. He worked with little. Honey to fight infection, beer to numb the pain, vinegar to clean a gash. When a bone broke, he would press it back into place while the patient screamed into a cloth. He wrapped twisted limbs in splints carved from river reeds and bandaged deep cuts with linen boiled and dried in the sun. There were no clean rooms or polished floors. He worked in doorways, under trees, or beside the hearth. The cries of the wounded mingled with the laughter of the marketplace, the bray of donkeys, and the rising calls to the gods from distant temples. He was paid, when he was paid at all, in bread, onions, and sometimes a single copper coin if a family could spare it. Often he received nothing more than a muttered thanks, or the quiet relief of a child's pain eased for a time. But when he failed, when fever rose or wounds festered, he bore the blame. He had no gods to shield him, no robes to mark him sacred. When a man died under his care, whispers circled quickly. Some said he was cursed. Others claimed he drew illness to him. There were times he was chased from villages, stones thrown at his feet, his name spat with bitterness. Still, he returned to his work, not because he was brave or foolish, but because he had nothing else. Once long ago, he had studied under a temple healer, a stern old woman who taught him to read the swelling of joints and the smell of wounds. But he had no birthright to inherit her title. The priests would not allow it. His lineage was poor, and so he was cast out, left to heal those the temples would not bother to treat. And yet, even in the harshness of his life, there were moments of grace. The girl whose hand he saved from a venomous bite, who grew to become a weaver and left him a piece of dyed cloth each harvest. The old man with crushed ribs who lived another 5 years, sitting each morning by the Nile to greet the sun. These were his sacred rites, quiet and unseen. At night, when the villages fell still and the stars returned to their silent watch, he would sit outside his mud brick hut and grind herbs into powder. Basil, thyme, garlic, gifts of the earth with which he had fought off death more times than he could count. He spoke to no one, save perhaps the memory of his old teacher or the flickering flame of his oil lamp. He kept a bundle of linen strips tied with a piece of red string, never used, kept always clean. It was not for a patient. It was for himself. He knew the day would come when no one called him, when the gods would no longer delay the illness that brewed in his bones, and when that day came, he would lie down, wrap his own wounds, and drift into the silence he had so often witnessed in others. No tomb would hold him. No statue would bear his likeness. But in the fading breath of those he had helped, in the scars that marked recovery, there remained a trace of his touch. So now, as you rest beneath the weight of sleep, let your breath echo the slow grinding of herbs, and your dreams carry you through the quiet corridors of care and pain. Let the healer's lamp burn low, and the night be kind to those who mend in silence. We will return again to walk beside another forgotten laborer of this ancient land, whose toil, though unseen, shaped the pulse of eternity. In the dim corridors beneath towering pylons and vast temple courtyards, where incense curled toward the heavens and sacred chants echoed like breathless prayers, another figure moved unseen. He wore no priest's robe, nor bore any mark of divine favor. And yet, his presence lingered in every corner of the temple. In this 15th part of our journey through ancient Egypt's most thankless labors, we follow the temple cleaner, the quiet soul tasked with scrubbing the footprints from the house of the gods. He entered through side doors, long before the sun rose high enough to touch the sacred pylons. His tunic was plain, his hands red from lime water, and his knees calloused from years of kneeling on hard stone. While priests purified themselves in ritual baths and adorned their bodies with perfume and linen, the cleaner descended into the temple's dust-choked recesses, bearing buckets, worn cloths, and long-handled brushes carved from palm wood. His task was not one of reverence, but necessity. The temples were vast, rooms of painted stone and towering columns, courtyards where pigeons roosted and wind carried sand in through every crevice. The gods could not be seen to dwell in filth. Their statues, their altars, even the stones beneath their sacred processions had to shine. And so this man scrubbed, silently, ceaselessly. He cleaned the soot from oil lamps that flickered through the night. He swept away the footprints of worshippers who brought offerings with muddy feet. He polished the copper bowls and the alabaster basins, though he was not allowed to touch them during ceremony. Every corner was subject to his labor, from the grand hypostyle halls to the narrow storerooms behind shrines where rats sometimes nested and sacred scrolls gathered mold. He was neither slave nor priest, a servant of the sacred, but not sacred himself. He was expected to know the temple layout better than the novices. He memorized the hidden paths behind pillars, the secret stairwells to rooftop altars, and the order in which rooms must be cleaned to avoid disturbing morning rites. His work could never be seen, only its absence noted. A mist smear of oil, a leaf left near the altar, a cobweb above the god's statue. Any one of these could earn him punishment, or worse, exile from the sacred precincts. And yet, the temple was also his sanctuary. There was silence here, a hush that soothed the mind. He came to know the songs of morning birds from the rooftop, the way sunlight filtered through high slats of stone at noon, the feeling of cool shadow on his face as he swept the inner sanctum floor. Sometimes, when no priest was watching, he whispered prayers to the gods himself, not for wealth or glory, but for rest, for strength, for remembrance. No one answered, but the act of speaking, even into the silence, brought peace. He learned over time to read fragments of the hieroglyphs carved into the columns he scrubbed. He would mouth the names of the gods and queens, follow the curling forms of cobras and lotus flowers with his fingers, tracing stories he would never speak aloud. He knew which offerings were placed on which days, which oils were used to anoint the deity statues, and when the festivals of great gods were to be held. But he celebrated none of them. His labor was too constant, too needed, to allow pause. Once, he fell ill. His hands trembled, and his body burned with fever. For 3 days, the temple's air thickened with dust, and the incense smoke clung to grime that no one removed. A priest noticed, not by name, but by absence. The cleaner was summoned back, wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar to keep his sweat from fouling the air, and he resumed his work with shaking limbs. There was no choice. He was paid in rations, bread, beer, a bit of salted fish, enough to survive, not enough to marry, not enough to save. At night, he returned to a stone cell near the servant quarters, where he washed his hands in silence and ate beside men who carved bricks or ground pigments for the temple murals. They spoke little. Their world was built on unspoken endurance. He aged beneath the god's gaze. His back bent more each year. His hands grew cracked and twisted from years of scrubbing limestone. He came to resemble the very stones he cleaned, pale, worn, silent. And when he finally failed to wake one morning, it was not the priests who noticed, but another cleaner sent to relieve him. His body was carried outside the walls, buried without rites, as temple servants often were. Still, his presence remained. The stones he polished shone for decades. The altars he cleaned bore the weight of offerings without crumbling. The gods he served without acknowledgement continued to receive their due, their homes gleaming in the sun, spotless and still. So now, as your eyes drift toward slumber, think of the hands that scrubbed behind the veil of sanctity. Think of the quiet man who moved like breath between pillars, who bore the weight of the sacred not with reverence, but with rags and water. Let your dreams take you through the cool corridors of the temples, where silence sings and devotion wears the face of labor. We shall return again to find another thread in the great tapestry of ancient toil, worn and weathered, yet essential to the shape of eternity. In the far reaches of Egypt's fertile lands, beyond the city walls and away from the echo of temple hymns, lay the great fields that breathed life into the kingdom. These were the lands the Nile had blessed with its annual flood, where silt turned to gold in the hands of laborers. And among them, hidden by reeds and sweat, walked the bird scarers, silent sentinels of the harvest, whose days were marked not by hours, but by the tireless flapping of wings and the endless stretch of sky. In this 16th chapter of our journey through Egypt's most burdensome labors, we wander with the bird scarer, whose life was given over not to building monuments or crafting goods, but to guarding grain and guarding it with his very presence. He was a boy, usually, or if older, a man made small by poverty. The land was not his, nor were the crops he watched over. They belonged to landlords or temples, whose scribes recorded every grain with scrupulous care. His charge was simple in theory, to protect the barley and wheat from the flocks that descended upon them like a second flood, ibises, crows, sparrows, doves, beautiful in flight, destructive upon landing. He had no hut, no shade. From sunrise until the last light drained from the western horizon, he stood in the fields, barefoot in mud or dust, depending on the season. His skin darkened, then blistered, then cracked under the sun. His eyes, once wide with boyhood wonder, squinted against the glare of sky on river. In his hand was a sling or a knotted cord, sometimes both. Around his neck hung a wooden clapper, carved in the shape of a crocodile's jaw. At intervals, he struck it to produce a sharp, dry sound that echoed across the fields. If that failed, he shouted, waving his arms like a heron startled by the reeds. The birds, clever and persistent, soon learned his patterns. He had to move constantly, change his rhythms, deceive creatures who had watched humans for thousands of years. He ate while standing, a hard roll of bread, a handful of dried figs. Once or twice a week, a neighbor or sibling brought him water in a clay jar. He drank sparingly. Too much would send him to squat in the reeds, and the birds would take their chance. And so he endured the thirst. He sang sometimes, to pass the hours. Old songs his mother once hummed, or fragments of hymns he had overheard in the village temple. The fields offered no applause, only wind. On quieter days, when the birds retreated and the air stood still, he watched dragonflies skim the water or traced shapes in the clouds that wandered west toward the desert. At times, he failed. Sometimes a gust of wind lifted a thatched scarecrow too early, revealing an unguarded patch. Or a moment of sleep stole him while crouched beneath a date palm. And in that blink, a dozen birds descended. The damage could be severe, enough to merit punishment. A scribe might report it. The landowner might dock his family's rations. Or worse, send him to work among the threshers, where the risk of injury was greater and the hours somehow longer. He feared storms most of all. The wind stirred the birds into panic, and they fell upon the grain like a black tide. The rain turned dust to slippery clay. He'd be soaked, his clapper silenced by water, his cries lost in the wind. Once, a boy his age slipped on wet straw and broke his leg. He was not replaced. The family received less bread that month. And yet, the bird scarer knew his importance. Not because anyone told him, but because he saw the effect of his absence. A single day missed, and the edge of the field bore pecked stalks and scattered husks. He learned to read the land, where the grain was strongest, where the birds preferred to settle, where the falcons circled in the sky and kept his task a little easier. Some mornings, an old man would pass by on his way to the river, offering a nod. Rarely, a woman left a slice of honeyed bread on a stone. These gestures, though wordless, were treasures, proof that perhaps someone noticed the boy in the field. He grew thin, wiry, and quick. His voice, once shrill, deepened with use. He could strike a clay pot with a stone from 10 paces, not from violence, but necessity. In the village, he was rarely called upon. He smelled of sweat and straw. His skin was weathered like old leather. But in the fields, he was king of the sky. No bird dared stay long when he raised his sling. He aged into his 20s. Few bird scarers lasted so long. Most moved on, to brickwork, to canal digging, to army service. He stayed. His back bent early. His hearing dulled. His joints cracked when he walked. But still, he guarded the grain. And when one season came where he did not appear, the birds returned in force. The fields suffered. A child was sent in his place, but he wept in the heat, and the birds knew he was no threat. The landowner ordered a scarecrow built in haste, but it was too late. The harvest lost its shine that year, and somewhere, in a narrow village grave, the bird scarer lay beneath a mound of dirt, his name forgotten but his task unfinished. Now, let your breath slow like the wings of a bird settling into the reeds. Let your thoughts drift above the golden fields and hear the faint clap of wood across the breeze. The birds retreat, the sun sets, the boy stands watch no longer. He has earned his rest. We shall return soon to uncover another soul whose labor wove the threadbare fabric of a civilization that still whispers through time. In the quiet reaches of Egypt's dusty outskirts, where the scent of earth mingled with the acrid tang of sweat and animal musk, there existed a job so grim, so steeped in daily discomfort, that even the beggars and vagrants gave it wide berth. It was the domain of the tanners, those who worked with the dead skin of beasts to create the supple leathers prized by soldiers, craftsmen, and scribes. And in this 17th chapter of our journey, we step into their world, pungent and punishing, where labor wore no mask of sanctity and every breath tasted of rot. They worked outside the city walls, always, too foul for the sacred air of temples, too offensive for the clean streets of merchants. The tanner's yard sat near the refuse heaps, close to the river yet far from its beauty. No one passed by unless they had business there, and few stayed long. Even the wind, when it turned in their direction, was a cruel reminder of their place in the world. A tanner's day began in darkness, not from nightfall, but from habit. Before the heat rose to boil the mixture of chemicals and hides, they had to begin the day's preparations. Their garments were stained beyond washing, hardened in places where lime and blood had dried and cracked. Their hands, always wet, always raw, never healed. The smell of them preceded their steps, soaked into every fiber of their being. They worked with skins torn from oxen, goats, antelope, and sometimes even crocodile, prized for its toughness and used in armor and ceremonial wear. The hides arrived fresh from the slaughterhouses, often still slick with blood and remnants of flesh. The tanner's first task was to strip them clean, scraping fat and sinew with bronze knives worn to dull nubs. This alone could take hours. Then came the soaking. Large pits dug into the earth were filled with a slurry of water, lime, and pigeon droppings, the latter a rich source of ammonia, which softened the hides. The smell was unimaginable. It clung to the skin, to the eyes, to the soul. The men waded barefoot into these pits, their legs submerged, stirring the hides with poles or with their own limbs when necessary. They inhaled the sharp sting of lime mixed with excrement, their chests tightening with every breath. After days in the pit, the hides were removed, rinsed, stretched, and left to dry in the sun. During these hours, the tanner would beat the leather with flat wooden mallets to soften it. He would rub in oils made from animal fat or crushed plant seeds to preserve its flexibility. Each stage of the process required strength, patience, and an endurance few possessed. They were spat upon by children. Women crossed the street to avoid them. Priests refused to bless them. Many tanners lived apart from the rest of the village, forming their own quiet brotherhoods at the margins of life. They were not outcasts by law, but by smell and suspicion. It was said that tanners never stopped working, even in sleep. Their hands would twitch as if still scraping, their noses remained congested, and their dreams smelled always of lime and rot. If a tanner married, it was often to another tanner's kin. No one else would have them. And yet, they were essential. Scribes needed leather for sandals and scroll wraps. Archers needed it for their quivers, charioteers for their reins, priests for ceremonial belts and drum skins. Even Pharaoh's guards wore armor softened and shaped in the very pits others scorned. But the tanners who crafted it remained unacknowledged, paid in scraps and coin with the Pharaoh's face turned downward. In winter, their fingers cracked open in the cold. In summer, the heat turned the pits into steaming basins of pestilence. Disease was common. Cuts turned septic. Eyes became inflamed. Many lost their teeth early, their gums eroded by the harsh vapors. The average tanner did not grow old. Those who did bore faces lined deeper than the fissures in baked clay, and their voices croaked like frogs who had forgotten the joy of song. Yet, among themselves there was a kind of pride, not loud or boastful, but quietly firm. They knew their craft. They spoke of leather's temper like a potter speaks of clay. They could tell the age of an ox by the thickness of its hide and the future use of a goat's skin by its sheen under the sun. They were artisans in the shadows, shaping what the world wore while never being welcomed into it. When a tanner died, no temple would receive him. He was buried with haste, sometimes wrapped in the remnants of a hide too flawed for sale. But his tools were often laid beside him, a knife handle worn smooth by decades of toil, or a mallet with the ghost of 1,000 strikes still echoing in its wood. So tonight, let your breath slow, with the rhythm of leather stretched and hammered under the desert sky. Let the acrid wind pass over you and fade, and picture the man who stood waist-deep in filth, crafting the supple armor of kings, with hands blistered and unsung. We will return again, to uncover yet another soul who bore the weight of empire without ever once standing in its light. In the dusty back streets of Egypt's sprawling cities, far from the golden glow of temples and the solemn procession of priests, there existed a trade cloaked in quiet peril and relentless repetition. It was not a noble art nor a sacred calling, but one pressed upon the desperate, the potter's apprentice. And in this 18th chapter of our long and winding journey, we settle into the life of a boy whose world was shaped by clay, fire, and silence. He was taken young, as many were. Perhaps he was sold by his family for a few sacks of grain, or perhaps he was the son of a potter and knew no other path. Regardless, his mornings began with the same unyielding sound, the slap of wet clay on stone, the hiss of the kiln fire rekindled in the dark, and the soft grunt of his master rising to begin another day. The apprentice's hands were never clean. From the moment he woke, he was plunged into the earth, kneading clay until his arms trembled, his fingers blistered, and his nails filled with fine grit. The Nile provided the raw material, but the labor turned it into form. It was not the creative freedom of the artisan he knew. His role was foundational, endless. He fetched water from the river, hauled sand in baskets on his back, and stomped clay into submission with bare feet until it softened like dough. Each day, the same routine. He shaped nothing of his own. That task belonged to the master, seated before the slow-turning wheel, shaping jars and bowls with deft fingers, while the apprentice looked on in silence. When a vessel cracked in the heat or sagged under its own weight, the master growled. Sometimes he blamed the clay. Often he blamed the boy. In the corner of the workshop, the kiln loomed like a crouched beast, always hungry, always smoldering. It was built of brick and patched with ash and soot. The apprentice fed it ceaselessly with wood, dung, and dried reeds, sweating beside it in the fierce heat. He knew its moods. He could tell from the color of the flame or the way the smoke curled whether the fire was right. A misfired kiln could destroy a week's labor. The burns on his arms told stories his voice never would. Thin lines where the heat had licked too close. Blisters from hauling hot pots out with wooden tongues too short for safety. There were no ointments, no pauses. Only rags dipped in river water and the expectation to carry on. The workshop was both prison and home. He slept in a corner beside the racks of drying bowls, his mat dusty with powdered clay. Meals were simple, barley porridge, sometimes lentils. The master gave just enough to keep him working, never more. And yet there was no escape. Apprenticeship was a slow binding, and even if he fled, no one else would hire a boy half-trained with hands not yet steady enough to throw a perfect jar. He learned by watching, by failing. His hands slowly mimicked the shapes his master made. He began to feel the balance in the clay, the moment it could be lifted, the moment it would collapse. Still, his first vessels were failures. Too thin, too thick, off-center. Each mistake earned a slap or silence, both equally heavy. Yet there was something sacred in the repetition. Clay was earth made supple. It carried memory. Pots bore the breath of the Nile, the imprint of fingertips long since turned to dust. The apprentice came to understand that every bowl was a vessel not only of grain or beer, but of time. He handled broken shards unearthed from old kilns and saw the fingerprints of men centuries gone. It humbled him. On festival days, the master's wares were sold at market. Painted vases, drinking jars, incense burners, shaped like lotus blossoms. The apprentice followed behind, carrying the heavy baskets, but his name was never spoken. The buyers praised the work. The master nodded. The boy stood in the sun and waited. and still he dreamed. At night, when the kiln's fire dimmed and the stars wheeled above the courtyard, he shaped little figures from leftover clay. A bird, a tiny house, a fish caught mid-leap. He hid them beneath his mat. Not for sale, not for approval. Just for the joy of creating something that belonged only to him. Years might pass before he was allowed to sit at the wheel. Many never were. Some died from the dust in their lungs or from the fires that flared without warning. Others grew too tired to continue and faded into other trades, brick hauling, grave digging. But the few who endured became potters themselves, their backs bent, their hands wise. And when the master died, the workshop remained. Perhaps the apprentice inherited it, older now, hardened by flame and years. He might have taken a boy of his own, begun the cycle anew. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he left the trade behind and wandered the villages, known only by the roughness of his hands and the kiln smoke lingering in his hair. But his touch remained in thousands of vessels scattered across the land, used, broken, buried. Time would forget his name, but not the curve of his bowls, nor the strength of their base, nor the echo of water poured into them on countless mornings. So rest now, as the clay softens and the fire cools. Let your thoughts drift like the wheel, steady and slow, and feel the weight of earth made into form beneath careful hands. We will return again to follow another unseen soul whose work carved eternity from the silence between glories. Of course. Here is part 19 of the story. The wind stirred gently over the banks of the Nile as twilight drew its curtain across the land, and all things once golden with the afternoon sun now softened into muted hues of dusk. In a modest mud-brick house on the edge of a reed-woven village, a weary figure sat crouched beside a small brazier, the flickering light of the embers playing shadows upon his gaunt face. His name was Setu, and though many in the town passed him daily with little more than a glance, few knew the quiet torment his days were steeped in. Setu had inherited the misfortune of his father, and his father before him, a trade passed down like a curse, wrapped in the guise of duty. He was a leather worker, but not one who made fine sandals for the noble, nor sturdy satchels for merchants. No, Setu's charge was the preparation of animal hides used for binding the scrolls of legal decrees, tax ledgers, and royal orders. The parchments of power and pain, inscribed in ink upon the stretched skins of beasts, passed through his hands first. It might sound a respectable task to the unknowing, but those who lived near his quarters knew the stench that clung to his home, the acrid tang of lime-soaked flesh and the iron rot of blood. His life was an endless cycle of filth, scraping, soaking, drying, and cutting. His arms thick with sinew from the work, his fingers stained and raw from lye and sun. There was no glory in his trade, only the gnawing sense of necessity, the knowledge that the scrolls he fashioned helped build the machinery of the state, the commands to extract taxes from widows, the inventory of grain stored in the temple, the punishments ordered for minor thefts. Each day began before the sun had risen, as Setu trudged down to the butcher's near the eastern gate of the town. There, amid the buzzing of flies and the chattering of scavenger birds, he would barter for the freshest skins, always being careful not to look too long at the eyes of the animals whose bodies still twitched in death. He would haul the heavy hides home on a rough woven litter, the weight digging into his calloused shoulders, and his back wet with the first heat of morning. The next steps were ritualistic in their own dark way, submerging the skins in great vats of lime and water for days, then wrestling them out, his arms slick and stinging. With bone scrapers, he would remove every trace of flesh, every stubborn sinew and stubborn patch of fur, until the skin was pale and thin as papyrus. Then came the drying racks, wooden frames stretched taut under the open sun, where the desert winds cracked and cured the leather into its final form. The most punishing part of all was not the labor, nor the smell, nor even the loneliness. It was the knowledge that his work served purposes he did not agree with. Once, as a young man, he had tried to decline an order from a royal scribe, claiming his vats were full and his time strained. The scribe had returned with 2 guards, and Setu had been beaten behind his house. The lesson carved into his flesh with the blunt end of a staff. Since then, he had never questioned a request, and he had never again tried to look away from the work that must be done. Still, He bore the invisible weight of what passed through his hands. He remembered one scroll that had been hurried to him during the season of the Nile's flood, an urgent dispatch from a tax collector in Thebes. The leather for it had to be white and supple, fit for rapid inscription. 2 weeks later, he overheard a trader say that a whole village had been fined into starvation, their fields claimed by the temple estate. Setu had made the parchment for that decree. Sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, he would lie on the hard earth of his home and dream of another life. Not of riches, nor of palace halls, but of a job that did not wound his spirit. A fisherman, perhaps, casting lines into still waters, or a scribe whose ink told tales of love and moonlight instead of inventory and punishment. But dreams were for those who had fathers with freedom, and Setu's lineage had bound him like the very hides he scraped clean. Children in the village learned to hold their breath as they passed his yard, where the skins hung like ghosts upon the frames. They whispered tales of the leatherworker who never smiled, who spoke only to the wind and the fire. They said his hands were cursed, turning even clean water sour. It was cruel talk, born of ignorance, but Setu did not correct them. He accepted their fear like a second skin. It kept them away, and he preferred silence over false company. Only one person ever ventured close without fear, a young boy no more than 10, who would sit by the wall of Setu's yard and watch him work in fascinated silence. The boy never spoke, just stared with wide eyes as the leather took shape under skilled hands. Setu never asked his name, nor offered one in return. But once, when the sun burned high and the boy had not come, Setu found himself glancing toward the empty wall with a strange ache in his chest. One day, without warning, the boy brought him a gift, a small token, carved from bone in the shape of a bird. He left it silently on the bench and disappeared into the reeds. Setu held the object for a long time, feeling its weight, its smoothness. Something unspoken shifted in him that day, a crack in the wall of his weary heart. In that fragile moment, he wondered if the boy saw something in him that others could not. Not just the stink and the labor, but the hidden gentleness that still dwelled in the cracks of his soul. And perhaps in the silent gift of a bird, there was a reminder that even those tied to grim tasks could still carry the echoes of flight within them. So Setu worked on, as the moons waxed and waned, shaping leather under the burning sky. His days remained hard, but now, sometimes, when the embers burned low and the night whispered through the reeds, he would run his fingers over the little bone bird beside his hearth and remember that even in the harshest trades, something tender could still survive. The sun rose slowly over the delta, its early light brushing the Nile's waters with a soft golden shimmer. In the hush of morning, before the market stirred and the oxen were led into the fields, a low chant echoed through the narrow alleys of a town nestled beneath the gaze of distant pyramids. It was not a prayer nor a song, but a rhythm, a thudding, dragging rhythm that came from within the walls of the embalmer's quarter. There, behind thick mud brick enclosures, built deliberately to keep out both curious children and foul stench, labored a group of men whose names were rarely spoken outside their profession. Among them was Neferin, a quiet soul whose life had become a tapestry of ritual, decay, and the constant closeness of death. To others, he was a servant of sacred rites, a guardian of the soul's passage. But to himself, Neferin was something less poetic. He was a cleaner of corpses, a bearer of burdens no one else wished to hold. He had not always intended to walk such a path. Once, as a boy of 13, he had wanted to be a reed painter, one of those who made delicate images of lotuses and ibis birds along the walls of noble houses. But his father had been a mortuary worker, and when illness came like a slow drought upon their family, it was Neferin's young hands that were first called to help lift the dead. His fingers remembered the chill of that first body. A merchant woman wrapped in linen, her lips sealed and her cheeks painted falsely pink. It was a strange thing to look at death dressed in color. The job was not a singular one. There were duties layered like the bandages they wrapped around the deceased. First came the washing, the careful rinsing of the body in palm wine and river water, done with both reverence and efficiency. Neferin had grown accustomed to the quiet weight of flesh that no longer breathed, to the sunken eyelids and slack mouths. He had learned where to press and how to hold, his movements becoming a silent liturgy passed down from elder to apprentice. Then came the more secretive tasks, those spoken of only among the embalmers and never beyond their walls. The removal of organs, the packing of salt, the hollowing and drying of the body from within. These acts required not just strength, but a grim kind of artistry. Mistakes were punished, not by whips or words, but by the spirits themselves, or so it was said. An improperly embalmed body might curse its preparer from the afterlife, robbing them of peace in their own death. The work was long and draining, and though it was steeped in sacred purpose, it did not bring Neferin the serenity he had once imagined. Day after day, he stood bent over stone slabs, the scent of natron clinging to his skin no matter how much he washed. He grew accustomed to silence, for those around him spoke only when necessary. Their voices hushed, as if even the dead might take offense at careless noise. But what weighed most heavily on Neferin was not the physical labor, nor the morbid familiarity with death. It was the memories that clung to certain corpses. He could not forget the faces of the young, children no older than he had been when he began, now lifeless in his arms. Their tiny limbs stiff with death, their mouths sometimes frozen in an expression of surprise, as if they had not expected to be called away so soon. Once, a young boy had been brought to them, wrapped in a simple cloth with a single amulet resting over his heart. The mother had wept outside the gates, her cries so raw and filled with sorrow that even the older embalmers looked away. Neferin had been tasked with preparing the child. He had done so gently, whispering to him as if the boy might still hear, telling him of the river, of the stars, of the wind that would carry him. Afterward, he had hidden the amulet in the linen wrappings, against custom, so it would not be taken by grave robbers. That night, he dreamed of a boat drifting across the Nile, with a child standing at its prow, waving to him silently. Dreams like that came often, and they were not always kind. Sometimes he awoke gasping, sure he had heard whispers among the drying racks. The faces of the dead never left him fully. They visited in sleep, in the edges of his sight, in the stillness between one task and the next. Neferin did not complain. Among his peers, it was understood that suffering was part of the gift. To prepare the dead for eternity was to carry a burden heavier than gold. They were the invisible bridge between the living and the gods, though few thanked them for it. They worked in shadow, and when they died, their own bodies were rarely granted the care they had given so many others. There were quiet joys, though rare. Sometimes, a grieving family would offer a word of true gratitude, or bring food and incense in thanks. Once, a nobleman's daughter had pressed her hand to Neferin's, her eyes full of tears, and said simply, "You gave my father dignity." That sentence lived in his heart longer than any praise. At night, when the work was done and the fires burned low in the embalmer's quarter, Neferin would sit alone beside the sacred jars where organs rested and hum tunes he barely remembered learning. The flicker of flame would cast dancing shadows upon the linen-wrapped bodies, and he would watch them as one might watch old friends, familiar and quiet. He often thought of the end, not of others' deaths, but of his own. Would someone prepare him with the same care? Would a younger embalmer whisper stories to his still form, as he had once done for the boy with the amulet? Or would he be left alone, his body passed quickly through the rites, forgotten among the thousands he had tended? He did not know. But as he closed his eyes each night, the scent of resin and myrrh in his nostrils, he told himself a single truth, that he had served. That though his was a path of silence and shadows, he had walked it with steady feet. And perhaps, when his own heart was weighed by Anubis, it would be found light, not because of great deeds or songs sung in his name, but because of the quiet kindnesses he had performed for those who could no longer speak. The desert wind carried a thin veil of dust across the city of Memphis, as the sun, swollen and low in the sky, cast long shadows against the temples and the homes the weary. Beneath the gleaming limestone of the sacred necropolis, in a narrow subterranean corridor lit only by flickering oil lamps, moved a figure hunched beneath the weight of labor and history. His name was Bekenu, and of all the burdens carried by men in ancient Egypt, his may have been among the most feared. He was a tomb cleaner. To the common folk, the phrase sounded almost noble. Perhaps one imagined a man sweeping dust from sacred floors, ensuring the resting places of nobles remained unspoiled. But the truth of Bekenu's labor was far more grim and far lonelier. He was among the few who descended into abandoned, sometimes desecrated tombs long after they had been sealed, tasked with recovering stolen relics, clearing the bones of looters, or removing corpses of animals that had crept in seeking shelter or prey. Tomb cleaning was not a job assigned, it was one granted by punishment or desperation. In Bekenu's case, it had been the latter. Once a porter in the service of a wealthy granary, he had been blamed for a theft he did not commit. His name tarnished, his options few, he was given a choice: exile or the work none wanted. And so, for over a decade, he had walked the corridors of the dead. His days were spent in darkness, torch in hand, stepping over crumbled sarcophagi, faded paintings, and sometimes bones not meant to be disturbed. The air was always heavy in those tombs, stale, dry, with the faintest trace of decay that lingered despite the passage of centuries. Some tombs had been sealed so long that the dust in the air felt ancient, as though breathing it was to inhale forgotten memories. The work was not only perilous, but deeply unsettling. There were tombs where he swore the temperature would drop suddenly, as if the dead themselves were watching. He had seen jackals die after slipping in and being trapped, their bodies twisted and skeletal. He had once uncovered the body of a looter, his fingers still clutched around a golden idol, his face twisted in an expression that haunted Bekenu's sleep for years. The worst tombs, however, were not the ones ravaged by time or scavengers. They were the cursed ones. Rumors of curses hung heavy in Egypt, and though Bekenu did not believe in tales of sudden death or haunted dreams, there were places where he felt watched, unwelcome. One tomb in particular, deep beneath the cliffs of Saqqara, had been sealed after 3 men entered, and only one emerged, raving about whispers in the dark and shadows that moved like breath. Bekenu had been ordered to enter it alone, to clear the remains and seal it properly. He remembered that descent well. The stairs had felt like they fell away beneath his feet, each step echoing into the pitch-black void. His torch barely illuminated the path ahead, and the walls were covered in half-finished hieroglyphs, messages that trailed off mid-sentence, like the scribe had fled mid-carving. Inside, he had found what remained of the 2 lost men. Their bodies were untouched by claw or blade, but their eyes had gone wide with something unknowable. He had wrapped them in linen, said quiet words of peace, and left the tomb without looking back. Bekenu had never spoken of it again. His role was solitary. There were no companions in his labor, no friendly hands to lift rubble or carry tools. The tomb cleaner walked alone always. He spoke rarely, for he had learned long ago that words echoed too strangely underground, bouncing in ways that made it feel as though someone answered. At times, he would mutter to the bones, speaking aloud not out of madness, but to keep the silence from crushing him. When his work was done in a chamber, when he had gathered what was salvageable, placed offerings back on altars, or removed signs of desecration, he would sit in stillness and light a small cone of incense. Not as a rite, not by temple instruction, but for himself. It was his offering, his way of saying, "I see you, I honor you, even now." The smell of frankincense became his companion, more constant than any human voice. It clung to his robes, seeped into his skin. It marked him, as surely as the soot beneath his fingernails and the scars from falling stones. Bekenu did not often dream, but when he did, the dreams were filled with narrow corridors and whispering walls. Sometimes he would see a figure in the distance, a woman draped in linen or a child carrying a jar, and he would try to follow, but the tomb would twist, the path turn, and he would wake before reaching them. He lived in a small home by the cliffs, away from the city. Few visited. The villagers regarded him with a mixture of awe and dread. Children ran from his shadow, mothers offered him bread in silence. No one asked about his work, and he did not offer tales. Yet, despite the hardship, Bekenu did not hate his life. There was a strange peace in his labor, a rhythm as ancient as the stones he walked upon. He knew the stories etched into walls better than any scribe. He had seen depictions of marriages, of royal banquets, of wars and voyages drawn in ochre and lapis. The dead spoke in their own way, and he had become a listener. Sometimes, when he paused to rest beneath a painted ceiling, he would stare up at the stars carved into the rock and imagine they were real, that the tomb had opened into the sky, and he was lying not in death, but in eternal night beneath the heavens. As the sun bled its final light into the western hills, Bekenu descended once more, his torch crackling in the silence. Another tomb awaited. A new name, a new sorrow, a new chapter hidden beneath stone. And with slow, practiced steps, he walked into the earth once more, not with fear, but with the quiet dignity of one who had made peace with shadows. Far south along the winding Nile, where the river curved like a painted serpent between cliffs of burnt ochre, and the palms swayed to the rhythms of the wind, the laborers of the stone quarries began their day before Ra had fully risen. These men, often nameless to scribes and invisible to the elite, lived among the rocks and dust, mothers, sons, and fathers of children, swallowed by the very earth they helped shape. Among them was a man called Minui, whose arms were carved of toil, and whose eyes bore the weight of countless dawns spent beneath the hammer's echo. Minui was born in a village that no longer existed, its fields claimed by a shifting bend in the river many years past. His father had died in the same quarries, crushed beneath a slab meant for a temple. It was said his blood soaked the stone, and though the overseers replaced the man within a day, the rock remained marked, dark and cold, as if it had remembered. Menui was taken in by another laborer, and so he grew among the hammer song and dust clouds, learning early the rhythm of stone and sweat. The quarries were places of ancient violence, though no battle had ever been fought there. The pain was quieter, persistent, like water hollowing rock over time. It began with the weight of the hammer, a tool both sacred and cruel, whose wooden handle bore the sweat of 100 hands before his. Every strike was a conversation with the stone, an attempt to coax a shape from a creature that resisted every plea. The granite blocks demanded strength, but also patience. One wrong strike, and the rock would split in ways that rendered it useless. One careless moment, and the chisel might bite into flesh rather than stone. Minui bore such scars. A long, pale gash across his forearm, a broken toe healed crookedly, and fingers that no longer straightened fully. Yet these were badges more than wounds. They marked him as one who had endured. The days were cruel. The sun blazed mercilessly over the open pits, turning the pale rock to mirror-bright glare. There was no shade except that cast by the very walls they chipped away at. Water was rationed, meals were crusts and onions, dates when lucky. Overseers, wrapped in linen and authority, walked the rim above, watching with lazy gazes and heavy whips. They demanded output, not safety. A block too slow was a strike to the back. A pause to rest was a fine against the family's grain allotment. But it was not only the body that suffered in the quarries. It was the spirit. Minui often wondered, as he chiseled yet another block bound for some palace or shrine he would never see, if his life was nothing more than a slow erosion. The temples rose in cities he would never visit. The statues took the forms of gods and kings, not of the men who freed them from the rock. Even the smallest stela bore the names of architects, priests, or pharaohs, but never the quarrymen. And yet, despite the injustice, there was a strange beauty in the work. In the cool hush before the sun's fury, Minui would sometimes pause and place his palm on the freshly cut face of a stone block. It was smooth, warm from the night, and held the echo of millions of years. He would close his eyes and imagine the temple it would become, the columns it might form, the shadows it would cast in sacred courtyards, the way the light would fall on its surface during festivals of the sun. He found meaning in those quiet imaginings. Though his name would be forgotten, his work would endure. Somewhere, generations from now, a child might touch a wall of polished granite and feel its smoothness, never knowing it was Minui who freed it from its tomb of earth. That thought comforted him, in a way that bread and shelter could not. One day, word came that a statue was needed, one larger than any before. A likeness of the king, carved in full regalia, seated on a throne to guard the entrance of a new mortuary temple. The stone had to be perfect. No veins, no cracks, no flaws. Minui was among those chosen to seek and cut it. It took weeks to find. Deep within a canyon where vultures wheeled and the rock hummed with heat, they found the block, tall as 3 men and wide as 4. It was a thing of impossible beauty, veined with gold light and silent strength. Minui led the first strike, and when the chisel rang true, a hush fell upon the workers. They knew then that this stone would be remembered. The carving was not theirs to do. Sculptors from the capital would handle that, but the shaping, the liftings, the coaxing from cliff to river, that was Minuai's task. The process was agony. Ropes snapped, carts broke, men bled, wept, and fell. But slowly, inch by inch, they moved the stone. Minuai did not sleep during those final days. He walked beside the block like a priest beside a sacred relic. He sang to it in the night, not songs of praise, but lullabies his mother had sung before the river took her fields. When at last the block reached the riverbank and was loaded onto the great barge bound for the capital, Minui stood alone, his back broken with exhaustion. He watched it drift away, the wind in the sails like a whisper of something greater than himself. In that moment, he did not feel loss. He felt peace. Years later, when his hands could no longer lift a chisel and his eyes dimmed with age, a traveler from the north passed through and spoke of the great statue that now stood before the mortuary temple. "It is said the stone sings in the wind," the traveler said, as though the gods themselves shaped it. Minui smiled, though he said nothing. That night, as he sat beneath the stars with a cup of date wine and the quiet company of silence, he traced a calloused finger along the lines of his palm and whispered, "I was there." And so the tale of Minui, and of all those whose names lie buried beneath the glory of stone and kings, found its end not in a scroll, not in a temple carving, but in the hearts of those who walk the dust-laden paths of memory, forgotten in name perhaps, but never in the soul of the land they built.